This is the first of a series of lectures for Political Science 101, Principles of Political Science. And today we'll be talking about Sam Huntington's book, Political Order in Changing Societies. Now, as a caveat, Huntington's book is no easy read. In part, it's because of the examples that he gives to illustrate the various parts of his theory. These examples tend to be wide and varied, and I think it's often easy for students to get lost in the examples and not necessarily see the connection between those examples and the theory. So, if you will, imagine a line, and at the very far left end of that line is a very traditional society, one that basically family or has a dictator or a tribal leader. And then at the far right end are democracies or developed nations, Western Europe, United States. And for Huntington, he's asking a fundamental question. How do you make it from a traditional society to a modern society? How do you keep political order when the society is changing? Because order and change go hand in hand, and it's a very delicate balance between the two. So his question, what he's really trying to answer, is how do we make that journey? Now, to make it a little bit clearer, if you look at that line again, there's really, and break that line up into four distinct quarters, it's helpful to think about it in those terms because in that first quarter, you have a nation or a society beginning to move away from traditional sort of beliefs and traditional structures. And in the very last quarter, you have sort of that final thrust towards a modern society. The two middle quarters, the second and the third, is probably where most of the trouble, most of the difficulties reside, because in large measure, those are the most intense periods. You're far enough away from the traditional structure that you're looking for something to give you stability, and yet moving towards modernity close enough to be frustrated by the fact that you have yet to catch up. Now, keep one other thing in mind, that there is no point of arrival for modernity. In that far right end, it is not as if you reach a modern state and you stop. What is modern keeps moving out across the horizon. So you're always chasing that. So the United States, pretty modern society, can't sit here and just say we've reached the point of modernity, we're done. Because the world will keep moving forward, and what was once modern will be left behind for the new modernity. So this creates an interesting and special problem for those nations that are still trying to catch up. As they move at whatever speed they can afford to move in terms of stability, the place of arrival, the modern society, is moving further and further away from them. So that means to catch up, they need to move faster and faster. The society needs to modernize faster and faster. So they don't have the luxury of the 187 years that England had to modernize, or the 100 plus years the United States had to modernize. These states now have to move so much quicker that their people will become more stressed out. It's what I call the societal bends, moving too quickly and not being able to adjust. And that's really a problem. You need to move and catch up, but not to the point where you destroy the structure. All we'll often see is a snapback. That is to say, they're being pushed so fast to people by, let's say, the leadership, that it becomes almost too much to bear. And then people want to go back to a simpler time. They want not to feel so stressed out, if you will. And that's where you see some some backlash against the movement forward, a return to the good old days, or revolution. And we'll talk about each of those. So the struggle that the undeveloped nations have trying to move forward is very intense. And once modern, to keep up and move forward, has its own challenges, not the least of which is making the assumption that the society as it moves forward from today's point of modernity that it's going to go in a certain direction, move in a certain way. And so the people of the states, the nations that are modern, their challenge is not to misstep, not to move in a direction that turns out not to be a direction that moves them down the road, but one that might take them in another direction that they would then have to recover from. So at the far right, as those nations try and modernize, they have a predictability problem. Where is this all going? Those nations that are coming, or societies that are moving along and towards modernity, in a sense, that's an easier process for them because they can see where modernity is and they can move towards it rather than not know where it is and have some sort of estimate or guess about where it's going to go. So each stage along the way carries with it its own challenges. All right, so for Huntington, what is he looking at? His theory is that you've got political institutions on one end and you've got social forces on the other. That those two things reside in every society. Because Huntington is not interested in comparing society A to society B. His question is more about what do these two societies have in common? What do we need to address? What are the particulars that are not unique to either, but sort of form the foundation of both? And so, moving aside the different types of societal structures, you can then get to what it is that is consistent between them. So you don't get lost in this comparison of that society to your own, but rather you look at the process itself. So towards these ends, he comes up with how we should analyze these various societies to measure where they are in this process and what kinds of issues they're going to have to address in order to move forward, whether it be from today's present point of modernity onward or from a traditional structure towards modernity. So there are several important particulars here. The first is that in order to make this move, which is again to keep political order when the society is changing, because stable movement is what's going to move you most readily towards the horizon and also cause the least amount of problems for the people. Remember, we form societies, we form nations because we are seeking a structure against which to thrust our needs, our desires, and also create structures, political institutions, that will protect us during this process. There is no need in forming a nation if you don't get something out of it. And what most folks want out of a nation when they form it is a structure that will serve and protect them as they move forward. That there's somehow greater safety in those numbers. So one of the things he looks at is this idea of consensus. That do people agree? Do they have a general agreement about particulars? Can they agree on what they should be doing? Can they agree about what's important? Can you get enough people that sort of come together so you have enough support for a particular idea or direction? And if the social forces, which are again just groups of people that have a common interest or common connection, it could be anything from a club or organization, as we would see today, to a tribe, some consensus around key ideas or processes so that we can form a bond one with the other. Now, these social forces are not necessarily distinct. That is to say, you don't have someone that's part of social force A, but not part of social force B. As an example, the overlapping is very important. And as an example, you could have someone today in America that belongs to perhaps, the fire department, but is also, a business person. And so you've got the interests of the business person and the fire department residing in one individual. And you'll see why this is so important later on. So social forces are not necessarily distinct categories, but they are a myriad of categories that there's a great deal of overlapping with. So consensus then is key. You need to have a group of people that when they come together have some general understanding about what matters, what's really important. The second thing you have to develop, or that we want to see in order to know that the society can modernize or move forward and remain stable, the second thing is a sense of community. And what we mean by community here is belonging to something larger than oneself. That somehow we are bound one to the other because of various beliefs, hopes, fears, that we come together one to the other and sort of form a bond where we're distinct from perhaps other communities, right? I guess probably the simplest example I can give here is think of professional sports. There is a whole community that will form around a particular given sport or team. They'll have their own traditions. They'll do their own stuff that makes them feel unique in some way. So a community is just a number of people that rally around a particular idea or cause that they believe distinguishes them from others. So community is very important because they're a support group as you move forward. Belonging to a structure that's larger than yourself gives you some sense of security, not necessarily being the only voice. The third thing is legitimacy. What Huntington is really talking about here is that on the political institution side, you have to be able to rule and structure things, but you can't do that unless the people, the social forces, see you and your organization as legitimate. That means they look at you and say, yes, these people or this group should make decisions about X. So legitimacy for political institutions is absolutely key. If the social forces do not see your political institution as legitimate, it can't do its job. It no longer serves the greater needs of the people. The next is organization. Now, this is key because unless with all the good intent of the social forces and all of the strengths of political institutions, if this endeavor is not organized in some fashion, and if the institutions, political institutions, are not organized to deal with the stresses that are going to be placed on them by the social forces, and if the social forces themselves can't coalesce around ideas. I guess probably the best example of that today would probably be the Occupy movement, where basically there was really no organization. There was no leadership. There was no sense of community other than this vague idea in the disparity of wealth in the country. So organization is very, very important, although people tend to rail against that almost in the first instance, that somehow the things that are organized in a certain way embody some level of corruption and the like. So during the Occupy movement, you had people that came forward and said, well, I'm not the leader. There is no leader. There is no particular agenda other than to address a particular problem here. So organization is key. You cannot meet the demands of the social forces, and the social forces cannot create a structured and accessible demand unless there's organization. So as much as we may like to be free of all that, there's no escaping the need for it, because you can have effective political institutions that are disorganized, and you can have effective social forces if they're not organized. Why? Social forces, their job is to bring together the demands, to ferret through the various preferences, and come and give a unified request, demand, to the political institutions. because the political institutions cannot act on a vague, inconsistent idea of what the people want. And for their part, the people need to know where to thrust their ambitions against. They need to know where to go, who to seek out, in order to have those demands heard. So organization is key here. Then we have effectiveness. Obviously, this idea of consensus and community, legitimacy and organization, that's all wonderful. But in the end, you have to be effective. That is to say, if the social forces are going to make demands on the political institutions, those institutions need to accomplish something. They need to be effective. Social forces, for their part, bring together all of these disparate ideas and form a particular that they're looking to be addressed. But they have to be effective in doing that. Right? It can't be just pieced together. And then finally, for Huntington, it's this idea of stability. That when all is said and done, if the society collapses, then regardless of consensus or community or legitimacy, organization, or effectiveness, if it can't remain stable, stay on its feet, it can't keep moving forward. The social forces and the political institutions, they depend upon each other to move forward. The one organizing demands, social forces, the other, political institutions, meeting those demands, shaping those demands, and effectively allowing the social forces what they need in order to move forward. Now, stop for a second and think about the rule of law, and think about how important it is, basically in all of these categories. The rule of law says basically the society and everyone else will follow certain rules, and that those rules will not be, violated haphazardly, that there's a structure in place for changing the rules, but there are rules. That is critical to this idea of consensus and community, legitimacy, organization, effectiveness. But the rule of law is most important to this idea of stability. If we know exactly what the challenge is, and we know the rules for meeting that challenge, then we can all cooperate one with the other in a way that's not going to destabilize the government or the people. Remember, we form governments because we believe that those governments will better serve us than if we had no government. People just don't form organizations, governments, nations, for no purpose. They do so because they believe, we believe, right, that we are better off in terms of our own survival, in terms of the quality of our own lives, by being part of something bigger than ourselves. But that thing, which we call a nation or a government, it has to remain strong and stable. That doesn't mean it's not going to have its problems. It doesn't mean that we're never going to have to change any aspect of that government. In fact, we most certainly will. Moving forward, there's no way to escape that. But ultimately, we're forming this nation because we believe that this is the best way to proceed. And then there are all kinds of structural questions we have to answer about how we go ahead and do that. But that's not necessarily what we're interested in looking at. For Huntington, he's interested in that road. Not necessarily how we go about fixing a particular problem. He's not comparing how one nation fixes problem A and how another nation fixes problem A. He's interested that there is a problem A. And what does it take for any society, regardless of its structure, to meet the challenges presented by A? That's the Huntington approach. Again, the only way to really be able to look at this process is to keep it divorced from any particular manifestation of that process. In other words, if we start comparing either nation to nation or government type to government type, we kind of, from Huntington's point of view, we kind of lose what's really important in the analysis, which is what does it take for a nation to remain stable enough so it can move forward and modernize. Now here again, you could question this. You could say, well, okay, all this focus on modernization, well, why is that even important? Why should we concern ourselves with being a modern nation or not? Well, if we believe that better quality of life, and we'll get to define that in a second, resides in a more modern society, then that's where we probably want to be. So what does a modern society bring that a traditional society does not? And why is it so important to us to move towards that modern society? Well, let's look at a few things. Modern societies tend to, for example, have more advanced sciences. That means medicines, it means structural things, technology. It means things that could improve the quality of our lives. Now, I don't want to get into an argument about, well, are we better off now that we have the internet than we were before we had the internet? Are we better off now because there's cable than when there wasn't cable? These are conversations people like to have. But at the end of the day, I think all of us would say, well, there's problems with the technology and how it's being used, whether it's being used to spy on the average American or the like. There's a benefit to having it. Think about how quickly we can get access to all kinds of information. You want to know how to fix something, you go on YouTube. There'll be any number of people explaining how you go about fixing that particular thing. So we can argue about whether it is a modern society is the place that we want to be. But I think in the end, you'd be very hard-pressed to explain why it is that the modern society isn't more beneficial than a traditional one. Now, there are some difficult things along the way. Take religion, for example. In a traditional society, religion or some belief system probably plays a much larger role than it might in a modern society. Now, when I say that, I don't mean people become less religious. What I mean is that the ability to separate those things, governance from faith, becomes more readily possible in a modern society, and that reduces conflict. You can't move forward. You can't have a good quality of life. You can't have peace unless you have an acceptance of each other. That is to say, you have to make allowances for people that differ in the way they see the world, or you're always in conflict. And if you're always in conflict, you can't have the kind of peace that's necessary to enjoy one's life. Then you'd simply be in the state of uncertainty. And this is not a place, uncertainty is not a place where we tend to prosper. We need that peace, that order, so that we can then figure out where we want to go next, and then try and move the nation in that direction. So for Huntington, again, he looks at the problem and isn't interested in comparing the nations, but comes to the general idea that, look, this road to modernization, which we believe is a better place to be for a host of reasons, that to get there, you really need to form a strong society around consensus, around community, around making certain things have legitimate authority and power so that things can get done. That you have to have some organizational structures in place. And that those organizational structures and those social forces, they need to be effective. The social forces in bringing together the demands in a coherent manner, and the political institutions being able to address those issues. It doesn't mean, by the way, resolving them or always agreeing with the public. What it means is doing what the public needs done, even if at times the political institutions disagree. They then have to educate the social forces about why they disagree. And that's the sense of building consensus. That's how you do that. So if this is done well, then you have the most important thing in place. You have stability. And stability is critical in moving from a traditional society to a modern society, and is most needed during that second and third quarter where revolution is likely to crop up, where conflict is likely to happen, because people do not let go of the past so readily. And as you make that transition down the road, and you turn the corner into that second quarter, you're far enough away from a traditional society that where you now reside in this second quarter begins to become burdensome. What that means is now the things you believed, right, more and more become challenged. And when what you've held on to as having meaning begins to become questioned, this creates a great deal of uncertainty. And it's that uncertainty that begins to cause a breakdown in consensus, a breakdown in community, a refusal to see certain political institutions as legitimate, an unwillingness to organize and structure things. And of course, with all that comes a lack of effectiveness, which then just feeds back into the loop again and creates a further breakdown in consensus and community and the like. And ultimately, stability is lost. That ends the first lecture. We'll pick it up from there.